Darker Pastures is a prairie gothic horror anthology and contains scenes and themes which some listeners may find distressing. For specific content warnings, please always be sure to check the episode notes and listen at your own discretion. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy today's humbly hideous offering. Nothing ever dies, not truly, only takes on a new existence in ceaseless transformations. Our ancestors live on in us, in all that they left behind. The very bones under our feet sing in an ancient atonal chorus, the slow work of millennia grinding them into dust, so that they may become something new, woven into the mineral matrix of embryonic stone, or becoming absorbed into the living tissues of other plants and animals. Yet such survivals pertain to both good and evil, and can manifest in strange and subtle manners, especially in darker pastures. Episode 31, Gatherings. The day is darkly overcast, yet still heavy with the August heat, and the air is uncommonly still. Over the Dakota prairie, over the little town of lumber and brick that sprouts out of it like an unlikely weed, the tiny train depot at the town's edge, that is only a clapboard shack crudely painted in rusty red and off-white, and a creaking, splintering platform. Over it all hangs the oppressive heat and a sense of brooding expectation, of restless stillness. A buckboard wagon rolls over the prairie road slowly, moving toward the edge of town. Atop it sits a man, dressed in the stolid style of the local Volga-Deutsch farmers. Drawing to a halt beside the train station, he shifts uncomfortably on the rudimentary bench seat, casting his gaze about the currently empty platform, as though expecting something to suddenly materialize there. Something perhaps not altogether welcome nor wholesome. It is past the noonday hour, and there are few on the streets of the town, most either sitting to their midday meals or napping away the hottest hours before they return to their endless toils. The few who do pass nearby seem to ignore the man and his wagon altogether. The bellowing sound of an approaching train's whistle breaks the stillness, and the horses hitched to the wagon stir and snort uneasily. The man calms them and watches the train's implacable approach. As it grinds and screeches to a brief stop, only a single passenger disembarks. The man who steps down from the train, with only a single steamer trunk in hand, looks far taller than he is, due to his extreme thinness. His clothes are all somber black and white, of fine cut, but worn and faded almost to the point of shabbiness. His long, gaunt face is shadowed beneath his brimmed hat. The man looks around the platform expressionlessly, and only moves toward the wagon when its owner waves uncertainly at him. Stepping down from the bench seat, the farmer asks the new arrival if he is Ilya Gantz, pronouncing the name with a distinct Russo-German accent. The thin man nods in affirmation, and says, rather than asks, that the farmer must be Mr. Hermann Wert. Hermann welcomes him to the state of North Dakota, and takes his guest's trunk, stowing it in the box of the wagon. Then the two men climb into the bench seat, and Hermann, taking the lines in hand, gently G's the horses forward. As they roll out of town and over the prairie, Hermann begins to speak, repeating much of what he has already written to Gantz in his letter of pleading summons. Ilya nods once every few moments, his eyes fixed on the fields that roll by them as the town dwindles behind, and they move farther out into farm country. Wert tells once more of how his eldest daughter of only 14 years, Alma, has been strangely afflicted since the February of the previous year. Tells how at first they thought her feverish and tried to nurse her as best they could. When Alma began to rave of strange things, and her fever had persisted far longer than is natural, they turned hesitantly to the pastor of their little Lutheran church, a man named Konstantin Rosel. Rosel, still believing it was nothing more than natural illness, wrote for his old friend, a certain Dr. Burschel, who had come at his own expense from his distant practice in Milwaukee to treat the girl. Yet he too soon became perplexed at the stubborn and curious ailment that seems to consume Alma's body and yet leave her strangely energized and animated. After the doctor's ministrations failed to yield any result, and Burschel suddenly departed one early morning with hardly a word to anyone, returning by train to Wisconsin, the Reverend Rosel finally agreed to attempt an exorcism, something he had never yet had any calling to do. Yet even this desperate measure brought no sign of improvement. On the contrary, Alma grew still paler and thinner, and yet the perverse energy within her seemed only to grow and grow, and she now spoke in alien, unpronounceable syllables. Her periods of catatonic unresponsiveness became fewer, and her fits of incredible violence, by all rights beyond someone of her size and wasted frame, became more frequent. Hermann trails off as the wagon rattles and bucks over the rough ruts of the prairie road. Ilya has not moved, other than with the inevitable jostling of the seat, since Hermann began speaking. The patchwork of field and prairie around them teems with grasshoppers, grown fat and winged after a summer of voracious feeding. Despite the mugginess of the day, and the gray sky's mocking promise of rain, the summer has been dry here, and the grass and crops alike are sere and yellowing almost to brown. And the overgrown insects have become almost a plague. With a chitinous fluttering, a singularly large, red-legged specimen half leaps, half flies onto Ilya's shoulder, and, clinging with bristled legs to the faded and fraying fabric of his black jacket, it remains perched there, now almost perfectly still. Ilya seems to pay it no mind, but the sight of insect and man alike, inert and quiet as corpses, perturbs Hermann, whose nerves are already raw from over a year of an inexplicably and helplessly unsettled household. To drown out his troubled thoughts, the farmer begins to speak again, to enumerate all the ways the Dr. Burschel and the Reverend Rosel attempted to alleviate Alma's affliction. There were so many bitter medicines, tonics and tinctures and capsules, the names of which he has mostly forgotten. Then there were the special diets and fasts and exercises, and then ceaseless bedside prayers, and finally the disastrous 3-day exorcism of shouting and screaming and weeping that left everyone within the household utterly depleted, both physically and spiritually, save whatever lived within Alma, which seemed only more manically excited afterward. All of this Ilya has already more or less gleaned from the letter folded within his breast pocket, crinkled and glossy after many readings. The letter that brought him from his latest temporary residence in Topeka. Still he does not speak, does not move. To Hermann, he seems as heedless of the story as he is of the grasshopper near his lapel, and the farmer's mood darkens as he settles back into silence, which has come to feel as oppressive as the breathless, clinging heat. A humble farmstead emerges from the fields before them, seeming once well ordered, but recently somewhat neglected. At last Ilya speaks, saying that this is a lonely place. The sudden utterance takes Hermann by surprise, and he sits a moment before he really absorbs the words and musters a reply. Falteringly, he says that it is a home, his home and his family's, not lonely at all. Ilya shrugs, but offers neither apology nor elaboration, and they ride the rest of the way in silence. As they pull into the farmyard, 2 children emerge from the house to stare at the newcomer on the wagon. A boy of perhaps 12, and a girl of around 7 or 8. Hermann brings the horses to a halt and calls the children over, introducing them as his younger children, Walter and Lucia. He bids the girl to show their guest inside, while he and Walter unhitch the wagon and tend to the horses, and the girl nods obediently. As the 2 of them move toward the house, Ilya asks his gracious little host if she likes it here, so far away from town. She says that it's fine, that maybe it's sometimes a little boring, and that there's always too much work to be done, but that she and the neighbor children sometimes get to play in the late afternoons and during the winter. Ilya offers a rare smile, which makes his gaunt face seem somehow older and wearier. Then he grows grave again, and asks if she spends much time with her older sister. Lucia hesitates, and says that she did once, but that Alma is gone now. Gone where? Ilya asks gently, and the girl replies that she doesn't know, only that whatever is in Alma's room now is not her sister. Alma, she says, was too good to ever say the awful things that it does. Ilya nods, and the girl pushes open the door and leads him over the threshold. The house is tidy and welcoming, though somewhat austere, yet Ilya seems more ill at ease with each step inside. The housefrau emerges from the kitchen, having heard them enter, and she smiles and curtsies formally to Ilya, introducing herself as Gertrude. Ilya returns a deep, stiff bow and thanks her, referring to her as Mrs. Wert. Smells of baking bread, of roasting pork and vegetables issue from the kitchen behind her, and Ilya notes the copious sweat upon the woman's brow, and wonders if it is solely from the oven's heat. She asks if he is hungry, and before he can even respond, she says that the midday meal is almost ready, and that they will eat as soon as her husband returns. Ilya nods, and Gertrude tells her daughter to set the table, before disappearing once more into the little kitchen. As the girl sets to this new chore, Ilya quietly helps her, returning briefly the bright, appreciative smile she flashes at him. Just as they finish, there is a ragged cry from upstairs, long and low and bestial. At its emanation, everyone downstairs freezes, the mother in the kitchen just over the oven, the man and the girl in the dining room. But from the locked room upstairs comes a series of loud crashes and sharp cracks. Yet despite the appalling auditory violence of the outburst, the silence that follows is somehow far worse. After a long moment of bated breath and rattled senses, Lucia looks over to Mr. Gantz and reiterates that it simply cannot be Alma. No, Ilya slowly nods. Her sister is indeed gone. Mrs. Wert fusses over her guest during what proves to be an excellent, if simple, meal. She also tries to keep the dinner table conversation light, but this proves difficult. Ilya, even when trying to be friendly, is plainly accustomed to minimal interaction with other people, and his habitual reservedness makes his answers to her questions terse and uncomfortable. Yet Gertrude persists. She asks about the wife and children Ilya never had, about the parents and siblings he left behind in New York, and about his early life. It is only after much pressing that he haltingly tells of his long study of the Torah, Talmud, and Midrash, and of how he disappointed both his father and his rabbi when he abandoned those pursuits in favor of his current vocation. A brief silence falls over the table as the staid Lutherans absorb his words and look at the pork on Ilya's plate. untouched, only broken when there is another series of cries from overhead, then 3 loud thuds, like the heavy impact of a body against timber. Carefully setting down his fork and knife, Ilya looks to the parents and asks if he might see Alma now. The Verts slowly exchange glances, and then Hermann says slowly that perhaps they should wait until after dinner, when they will all be refreshed and fortified with filled bellies. Walter leans toward Ilya and mutters moodily that all the others are afraid of Alma, glancing sidelong at his father with barely concealed scorn. Hermann flushes but makes no reply. The next scream is like the shriek of a red-winged hawk, piercing and primal, but far louder and sustained too long, and toward the end it becomes polytonic, as though many throats now shriek in a marred and hellish harmony. As if continuing a conversation that never began, Hermann turns his gaze from the vague ceilingward point where it was momentarily fixed, back to Ilya, and asks what he meant earlier when he called their home a lonely place. Ilya fusses with his already well-ordered shirt and jacket, brushes away imaginary crumbs, before slowly saying that there are places in the world where unseen things gather and proliferate, like vermin in dark and fetid burrows. Such unclean spirits, he elaborates, are drawn to places of desolation, to inhospitable wilderness, and to ruins, to places where wicked things have happened and tainted the land with their dreadful memory. Carefully, he adds that there's something of all of that here, on their farm and the surrounding country, and that he can feel the way it calls to the impure and the malevolent. The father's face grows dark again at these words, clearly taking personal offense at such a description of his property, while his wife's features turn drawn and pale. Now a softer rapping issues from overhead, and Ilya stands and moves to the point precisely below the sound's source. After a few seconds of perfect stillness, he begins to speak aloud in a voice more resonant and commanding than he has previously evinced, a recitation which the Verts do not comprehend. The rapping slows and then ceases, but the quiet that settles over the house in its wake is unnatural, as though the entire world has frozen in place. Even the unnoticed but ever-present sounds from outside, the myriad stirrings of plants and small creatures, are gone. Then a long, shrill, wild cackling, far too loud and forceful to come from the lungs of an ailing child, cascades down the walls like a horde of fleeing cockroaches. When it finally echoes into stillness, a pale Ilya looks to the Verts at the table and says wanly that he wants to speak to the Reverend Rosal. Konstantin Rosal is a tall man, not quite as thin as Ilya, and without the hollow gauntness in his features, with hooded gray eyes and a closely cropped beard of pale brown. His speech is soft and thoughtful in manner, yet when Hermann introduces Ilya, the three of them standing on the threshold of the parsonage behind the church, Constantine does not invite them inside. Regarding Ilya with sober appraisal, he breathes a one-word question to the farmer. Jude? Before Hermann can answer, Ilya nods and says, in a German dialect markedly different from that of the locals, that bin ich. The pastor betrays his surprise with only a slight flutter of his heavy eyelids, then instantly regains his impassive expression. Switching to English, Ilya and Constantine converse economically on Alma and her condition, on its strange progression, on the specifics of the methods employed by the Reverend, and what little he knows of those of his friend, the Dr. Burschel. Ilya asks the pastor for his thoughts on the nature of the apparent possession, but Constantine has little insight to offer, and seems to grow very uncomfortable with the question. Never once does the pastor's icy reserve show any sign of thawing, and Ilya's manner is hardly warmer. After perhaps a half-hour of this clinical exchange, Ilya thanks Constantine curtly, and indicates to Hermann that he's ready to go. Bidding farewell to Reverend Russell, Hermann is unable to dismiss the feeling that the man's cool demeanor extends now to him as well. They ride home, the farmer sitting comfortably on his horse, while the man from New York is stiff and ungainly on his borrowed steed. Ilya seems untroubled by Russell's unfriendly reception, and the farmer wonders how many such welcomes he has received over the years. If that is a part of why he's so aloof and solitary in his habits. Hermann reflects with some shame upon that dinner-table silence with which he and his family greeted Ilya's mention of Talmudic study merely an hour or two previously. He's reminded, too, of things he's long forgotten from his childhood in the old country, of how people in his home village would speak of pogroms near and far, as though they were of little consequence, or even approvingly, the same way one might speak of spring rains. The two men return to the homestead just as the sun's disk first touches the western horizon. Hermann waves off Ilya's offer to help with the evening chores, and smilingly tells him to go inside and rest from his long trip, when a scream from the house splits the air. They begin to run toward the farmhouse, but before they've even halved the distance, Gertrude emerges from the front door, blood smeared across her forehead and on her hands. "She cut me," the farm wife says, repeating it twice in disbelief. Ilya and Hermann share a glance before moving to help the wounded woman, and the look in Ilya's eyes terrifies Hermann. Whether it's the fear there that terrifies him, fear from a man much more learned in the shadowy mysteries of hidden worlds, or whether it's the fascination that is mingled with the fear, the farmer cannot decide. For 3 weeks Ilya tries to relieve the girl of her unwelcome guest. 3 long weeks of fasting and prayer, of benefices with ash of incense, and anointing with rare oils, and other small rites and charms commonly known to holy men and occult scholars. 3 weeks of rarer rituals, food and drink that borders on poisoning, ancient and sometimes forbidden invocations and evocations, of sleeplessness and shivering cold and feverish heat. 3 weeks of dismal failure. Even the 7 prisms of Sagenberg do nothing to quell the ranting fury of the pale little girl who speaks in Latin and Greek, in Aramaic and Old Hebrew, even in fragments that Ilya fears are older than Harappa and Giza and Sumer. Each dawn finds Ilya a little thinner and weaker, and despite a mirrored physical wasting in Alma, every evening the thing within her seems stronger, even fuller somehow, as though it gluts and strengthens itself upon its adversaries' trials and miseries. Sometimes, during the heights of their eldritch confrontations, the thing mutters and gibbers into the pregnant dark between them, of former lives, wicked and wretched beyond belief. It boasts of taking 19 Sioux scalps under General Sully, not only from warriors, but from the elderly, from women and children. It moans of its longing to take more, hundreds, thousands, and to make a regal cape of long train from the grisly fabric of so much death and horror. When it speaks of this, its voice is soft and slurring, with a distinct drawl. Other times it talks in a voice far lower and harsher, and carrying a faint Black Sea German accent. Of its little kingdom, where it once held sway over a rude sod house, a ruder chicken coop, 3 small and pitiful fields, and a pen of pigs. It talks of how it lured so many young men to it, with promises of food and a bed for the mere price of a little honest labor. Young men far from home, or who maybe never even knew a true home, and desperate for succor, and of how it would use and destroy those young men, and feed what was left to the pigs. It speaks of the delight it took in this, in both the concealment of its crimes, and of taking those pigs to market in town, where the hungry buyers, the voices' erstwhile neighbors, would later unwittingly dine upon pork succulently fattened by human flesh, a monstrous and secret circularity at which the thing within Alma barks endless hyenic laughter. And occasionally a third voice, sounding aged far beyond Alma's years, and bearing a feminine trace of Eastern, even aristocratic origins, speaks of the mercy trains that brought it so many mouths to feed, so many idle hands to put to honest, purifying work. And it speaks of itself as a sort of guardian angel, shepherding these small souls away from the temptations of the devil and the empty joys of worldly fulfillment. It speaks of how many little souls it saved by depriving the bodies, then laying them, small and withered, into the earth before the impurity of sinful pleasure could touch them. During these black hours, the three distinct voices that issue from a single throat make Ilya's face seem gaunter and greatly aged, and his flesh ripples, cold and clammy. For one unclean spirit, he thinks, is a bitter enough foe, but three gathered in a single body is beyond his mortal ken. Sometimes, he fears, it is beyond any power upon which he can call, for the knowledge he has so painstakingly collected since forsaking his early rabbinic studies is as tenuous and elusive as the rare prairie fog. Slowly, he teases out names from the evil voices. After countless hours of tedious interrogation in the face of their diabolical mockery and goading, of their relished tales of depravity that make Ilya so nauseous he doubts he can ever enjoy another meal. The scalper answers to the name of Aeneas Smith and claims to have held the rank of lance corporal during the wars against the Sioux people. He is so proud of his exploits that extracting his name and story takes little effort. Jörg Kettler is the birth name of the murderous pig farmer, though he prefers the anglicized version of his first name, George. When Ilya, after much hesitation, asks Hermann during one evening of rare rest whether he knows the name, his host is horrified and says that Kettler was once their neighbor, shortly after the Werts and several other families had finally arrived on these prairies from their distant homeland, living only about 12 miles from this very house. Few ever had an ill word to say of Jörg Kettler, beyond that he was a little aloof and miserly, and too eager to mingle with outsiders. And Jörg had died of a bad heart well into his 60s. The woman is the most difficult to prize information from, proving coyer and cleverer than the masculine voices. But at last Ilya learns that she went by Dinah Creed. The name means nothing to Ilya or the Werts, but when Constantine visits one evening, frosty as before, and clearly driven more by a nagging sense of duty than by kindly feeling, Gertrude manages to coax the knowledge from him. Dinah Creed, a moderately wealthy widow whose husband had cunningly and mercilessly acquired a massive acreage before his premature death from stroke, was known to have adopted dozens of orphans, and to have used them as unpaid labor in maintaining the sprawling expanse of farmland just outside of Bismarck. Upon her own death from a nighttime slip on the stairs of her large and beautiful home, the remains of many of those children were found buried in an unused corner of a large barn, the very same barn that the surviving orphans had been compelled to sleep in every night. Cold in the winter, hot in the summer, always hungry and filthy, their bodies emaciated and misshapen from malnourishment, overwork, and untreated injuries. It was later determined that the orphans had been forced to bury their own dead, and knew that they slept near the decaying bodies under a thin blanket of soil. At the end of those 3 weeks, Ilya, on the precipice of utter despair, takes to his bed and lies unconscious for 3 full days, while the worried parents fret over him without daring to disturb his rest. And when he wakes at last and speaks to them, a conversation of several hours, they find no reprieve in his strange and terrible utterances. After his long sleep, which barely replenishes him, but which is all the time Ilya dares give over to rest, Ilya pores over the musty volumes which comprise the bulk of his steamer's contents. Some are almost 2 centuries old. Many are incomplete and damaged. All of them are exceedingly rare, and took great pains to acquire. And yet, for all of that, most of the information in their yellowing pages is too vague to be useful, or woefully inaccurate, or even utter nonsense. This has always been the way of his occult studies, both through reading and through stranger and more immediate experience, winnowing mountains of chaff to find but a few grains of true wisdom. It's only by chance, when he drops his copy of the Liber Susuri Mortuorum Memphites and opens it to the wrong page, that he finds the mention of Minmosa's 12-fold seal, an exorcistic rite of which Ilya has only heard vaguely and distantly, always mentioned with mingled tones of awe and trepidation. The text, arcane to begin with, and translated at least 3 times from Demotic to Koine Greek to late Latin, is almost impenetrable, and it takes him the better part of a day to be certain he has even understood the passage correctly. Even then, he sits in hesitation, looking out the window of the tiny room where he rests and reads, a room which was previously the bedroom of the 2 younger children, before their sister's cries made it impossible for any of the Verts to find sleep upstairs. Minmosa's seal, if the text is accurate, is far more precarious a route than he even guessed, but none of the tamer, more familiar methods he has attempted so far have even phased the abomination for more than a few moments, let alone shaken it free from the body it has so cruelly usurped. Despite his misgivings, by evening he has resolved to attempt it. And when he enters Alma's room, careful as ever to prevent her frequent and vicious attempts at escape, he is both surprised and unsettled to find her lying on the bed peaceably, smiling at him with gleeful amusement and anticipation. In the sitting room below, gathered around the blazing fireplace, the Verts huddle, waiting for the next round of screams and invocations and mocking laughter. For the crashes and poundings that will surely come. None of them say a word, each lost in their own dark and listless thoughts. The father broods on his own helplessness. The mother on lost days of what now seems like perfect peace in her house, and of her Alma's face when she was little more than a babe. Walter, already grown moody with the coming of pubescence, is now drowning in a sea of bitterness and contempt for all around him, and most of all for himself. Little Lucia thinks only of the elder sister, both playmate and idol to her, who is now so inexplicably and irretrievably out of reach. A voice, imperious and speaking in syllables wholly foreign to their ears, falls through the floorboards to them, and in answer comes a loud hissing, like an angry house cat, grown to behemoth proportions. All of the Verts feel a prickling on their skin, like the goose flesh that a sudden cold draught brings, despite the warmth of the crackling fireplace before them. That feeling only intensifies, and there are 3 cracks like nearby thunder strikes, and then what sounds like the spilling of water. The sense of burning flesh and of waterlogged rot fill the air, and beneath that, something not unlike the cherry brandy that Hermann sips on rare occasions, only sharper and sourer. The little ram's horn, which Ilya has twice played before in his failed attempts at exorcism, blasts 3 short but complex melodies, and repeats them twice. The house around them, so solid and well built, begins to creak and groan, and then to quiver, thin clouds of dust and tiny splinters shaken loose, drifting down onto the heads of the bewildered family. An ugly, drawling male voice shrieks, promising to take their scalps, to take their eyes and tongues. And it's followed by a deeper voice that says it will feed them all to the pigs. Then comes a long, piercing wail that sounds like that of an aged woman. And then there's only Ilya's voice, still speaking in that strange language that has been dead for millennia. The house stills, and the smell abates, and the Verts look at each other in cautious hope. And now another voice, like distant thunder, and yet also like the sliding and shifting of a million old bones, like the skittering of countless small and filthy things, unseen in the deepest, darkest caverns, answers in the same language, and then in another, and then in 100 all at once. Ilya cries out, suddenly and sharply, and then his cry is cut short, but the voice that is calamity continues in its polyglottal chorus. A final apocalyptic crack makes their vision flash white, and their skulls feel cloven by axes of red-hot iron, leaving them mute and stunned upon the floor. In the silence that follows, there is a soft sliding and then a heavy thump from above. The first to stir downstairs is Gertrude, thinking only of her daughter above, the daughter she still and will always love, and she struggles to her feet and begins to unsteadily ascend the narrow stairs, when a figure looms in the darkness above her. She stops and looks up, her heart on the verge of cracking her sternum. Alma's soft voice, sounding dazed and on the verge of failing, falls down to her with a single querying word. Mutti? Ja, mein Liebchen. Gertrude staggers upward, smiling and weeping and shaking with disbelieving joy. Hier bin ich. And she takes the wasted, pallid girl in her arms, and the two of them cling to each other for a long moment, while the father and siblings rise and look on in wonder beyond all words. Through the autumn and the winter, Ilya remains with the Werts, vigor returning only by tiny increments. He helps with the farm work as much as he is able, insists on doing so despite his host's protests, determined not to be a burden, and assuring them that it will help him build back his strength. The latter proves to be a lie, with even a little exertion, leaving the breath rattling in his throat, and his head and heart pounding. And he often goes to bed early and rises late, unable to sleep less than 10 hours most nights, no matter how he tries. Alma, though by all signs finally and fully free from the clutches of the unclean spirit that so long robbed her of her body and her volition, is likewise frail and slow to mend. Yet despite all this, they both remain cheery. And though Alma remembers almost nothing of her time under that otherworldly bondage, she seems to instantly regard Ilya as a sort of uncle. The two of them talk often and long, and Ilya's former reserve at last melts away. The other children, encouraged by the return of their good-natured older sister, follow her in this affection, and Gertrude always serves him the best portions of their meals, and takes great pains to see that he's comfortable during his stay, telling him that he's welcome in this house forever. If Hermann is at all bothered by this, or by the way the other families sometimes murmur about them, when the Werts attend church on Sundays, he gives no indication of it. At last, spring comes, and with it, a letter addressed to Mr. Ilya Gantz. When Gertrude brings it to him, Ilya's face falls slightly, and he reminds her again of the solitary and strange man who first arrived on their doorstep. After reading it, he says somberly that when the last of the snows melt, he must go west. And though the words make her want to weep, thinking of how fond both she and her children have become of this benevolent presence under their roof, this man who rescued her daughter when no one else seemed able, she nods and says she understands. The three of them, 2 men and a girl, look on from the creaky wooden platform as the train rolls in, its brakes squealing and its engine huffing impatiently. The thinner of the 2 men turns toward the others, and his pallid face looks sorrowful but resigned. Alma thanks him again from the crude wheelchair her father has constructed for her. Despite the difficulty of travel in her state, she insisted on accompanying the men, to the train depot and seeing Ilya off. Though the Verts have taken great care to feed both the exorcist and the exorcised over the winter months, they both remain thin and frail. And Ilya is certain that neither of them will ever truly recover from that final confrontation. Still, his heart surges with joy, and even with fatherly affection, when she takes his hand and presses it tearfully to her face, and says that she hopes God keeps him safe and sees him happily home, wherever that may be, and whenever he may find it. Ilya gently squeezes her hand, and wishes her a long life and health, but even as he says it, he fears that neither of them will be so blessed. When their hands disentangle, Ilya is surprised to find that he too is weeping, for the first time in many years. Hermann too takes his hand and shakes it, then, after a moment, pulls him into a brief, strong embrace, murmuring that Ilya has brought his daughter back to him. After they part, he tells Ilya that he may ask anything of him or his family, if they can ever be of service. Ilya smiles, and for once the expression fully lights his face, and he says that he's glad to have met Hermann and his beautiful family. Then, with but a few more words of farewell, Ilya hefts his trunk and boards the westbound train. It's only after the engine has roared once more into life, and the train clatters on its iron path, away from the little Volga German town, and out into the wild, desolate prairie, that the smile and the joy in Ilya fade once more. As he stares out the window at the wide, cultivated fields that slowly give way to open, dusty grassland, he wonders where the thing that tormented the Verts has gone now, and if it will ever truly leave either him or that psychically bruised family, or if it will haunt their dreams and subconscious minds forever. And he wonders if, even now, it roams the vast spaces into which Ilya gazes, if there are more of its kind, and how many places there are for such foul things to gather and multiply, fattening themselves upon past evils and the promise of those yet to come. And he thinks, too, of those awful promises made in that final spiritual battle. Promises made in several languages known to Ilya, and dozens more besides. Some of them were of future torments, and still chill him to his marrow. But worse even than those were the honey-sweet ones, the offers to fulfill desires he never even knew his heart harbored. Ilya shivers and draws his coat around his body, but even so, he feels like the blood in his veins has turned to ice, and like his body lies naked to the scouring of stark blizzard winds. The sun, approaching its zenith, shines down bright and unseasonably warm on the ancient, reticent plains beyond his window. Story, narration, and music by Lars Mollevan. If you enjoyed today's story, please share the podcast with the world and rate and review wherever you may listen. Thank you for joining me. We'll meet again in darker pastures.